So I'll be brief. I don't know if Rob or a brother might have any other guiding questions that you might have about Greenwood Hills before we go into a little bit from the Word.
No, I think that's a good overview, and we know you're in the midst of this transition, like your first year in this new mode of approach. So maybe just one quick word about MOPS. I know you still have mission orientation program. Greenwood Hills is the place that those are always held. Is that correct?
Yes, so CMML uses the grounds, and we have had a very good relationship with CMML for many, many years. So the missionary orientation program is generally held at Greenwood Hills, and was, in fact, this last June, about a couple of weeks before Summit Week. I was up there for a day of it, not involved in the ministry, but I was up there for other reasons, and ended up seeing a lot of the people there, both missionaries who are participating in the giving side and those who are on the receiving side. So that's been a wonderful partnership, if you would put it that way.
Yeah, and just one last question, and then we'll turn it over to you for the Word, brother. But I thought I read somewhere that if you just passed the 100-year mark at that camp, and is it the oldest assembly camp in North America? I think it is, but maybe you know better.
Oh boy, no, I think maybe you would know better. But I think it has not hit the 100 mark. Just a little back of the envelope, quick thinking. I think we're getting close. We'll be approaching 90, I think. So if you kind of rounded it off, I think we're at about 100, but we're below it a little bit. But it's definitely within range. And I don't know about other camps if we're the oldest, but we are, compared to the ones that I personally know about. Yes, we're older than they are. All right. Okay. Well, that's wonderful. Let me try to share my screen here. And oh, I've been disabled from screen sharing. Let's see if we can get that changed.
So Ray, if you could give Craig the screen sharing ability, that'd be great.
Well, while we're getting the screen sharing set up, if you could turn to Genesis 12. I'd like to just share something from Genesis 12 with us tonight. Oh, there we go. It looks like it's coming in. Okay. All right. What I'd like to do is talk about the long-term propagating effects of our lives and decisions that we make. A lot of times we make decisions and may not realize the long-term propagating effects of what we're doing. And the point of tonight's message is to ask us to think seriously about our lives. And as we see that decisions we make in life, when we count how serious they are for the future, sometimes we need to count in a long-term sense and capture the long-term and propagating effects. And I like to look at it in both bad and good ways. So ignore for a moment all of the references. We're not going to read all of them, but just the Genesis ones. And I'll read Genesis 12, 1 through 3, and then 10 through 20. Genesis 12, 1. Now the Lord had said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now come down to verse 10. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarah his wife, Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, This is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So it was when Abram came into Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her, and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? I might have taken her for my wife. Take her now and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. Now, in thinking about the propagating effects of our lives, I'll ask us this question: when is the judgment seat of Christ? And that is, when is the time, this event that is talked about in 1 Corinthians 3, when our works in building this building called the church, when our works are going to be evaluated, not to determine if we're going to get into heaven, but for rewards for those who are saved, who do good things. When is this event? And the two choices are, is it immediately after we die? So let's say if I were to die tonight, I would have my judgment seat of Christ immediately. And then maybe if you were to die tomorrow night, then you would have your judgment seat of Christ. So does it happen right when we die? Or do we all wait and have the judgment seat of Christ as one event that takes place for all of us? So is it right that we have our individual judgment seat of Christ after we die? Or is it that all who die wait for the coming of the Lord, and then those who are alive are taken as well, and we all have ours together? Now, you might think this has nothing to do with Genesis 12 that I read, but hang in there for a moment. We'll get there. So the answer is the second one. That is, those who would die, who are believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, wait. And the judgment seat of Christ is an event that is held together. We know this from 2 Timothy 4, when at the end of Paul's life, he says, Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing. So what he's saying is, those who love his appearing, who will be alive when Christ comes for them in the air, are going to receive their crown and rewards at the same event when he receives his crown and rewards. So it is the second one. We all who die wait, and we all have the judgment seat of Christ at one time together. Now, maybe a more interesting question is, why is the judgment seat of Christ held to the end? Why not just have it all at the same, right when we die? And I'd like to say that it is only at the end when the propagating effects of our lives are known. So 1 Corinthians 3 talks about the building of a building. It's the church. And warning is given, take heed how you build, and that if you build well, you'll receive reward. So when is the right time to evaluate our contribution to the building? Well, the right time is when the building is finished. So let me explain maybe with an example what it is I'm talking about with these propagating effects of life. So if you think, I'd like to tell you about a missionary and I don't even know his name. He served the Lord well over a century ago, and he went to places in Syria sharing the gospel and establishing evangelical churches. Now, my dad was raised in a family who went to that evangelical church. And my dad came under the influence of the gospel there and was saved in Syria. In 1954, my dad traveled to the United States to go to school. He ended up getting married, getting a career here, and living here in the United States, and having a family. He lived in South Carolina, then North Carolina, then Maryland. And having a family, he had me, who went on to grow and be raised under the sound of the gospel in our home, and is now spending a Tuesday night with believers in New York talking about the Word of God. Now, I don't know that that missionary in Syria ever thought that in the year 2021, the things that he did would have some impact and effect on what's happening on this Tuesday night in New York, but it is. And so this example of the missionary in Syria is kind of like the things that I'm talking about, that this missionary in Syria does not know, well, in heaven, I take it he knows, but when he is laboring, he has no idea what's going to be happening a century or more later that is a result and an effect of his work. So that's the purpose of this message, is to remind ourselves we should judge nothing before the time. God can use our efforts that might seem of little fruit to his glory, even in generations to come. And I'll just stop and mention again about Greenwood Hills. There is no telling what the Lord has done through Greenwood Hills in the propagating effects of what's happened there. I know I went through a very interesting crisis moment at Greenwood Hills that the Lord spoke to me in a very special way there and under the ministry that took place there. And it has helped me throughout my Christian life and my own Christian service. And I think that there would be thousands, literally thousands of stories of people saying things that were critical that happened at Greenwood Hills that propagated on in their lives, and a domino effect going on to other lives after that. Now, Abraham is going to be our example, and that's why we read about him earlier. So John, we'll take the bad news first, which is the bad news of what he did in going down to Egypt. Now, interestingly, even though he tells this lie, even though Sarah was his half sister, he doesn't tell the truth about that. And even though he should not have been going to Egypt in the first place, which I realize is easy for me to say because I'm not in the middle of the famine, but nonetheless, it's true. And he ends up being protected by God there. He ends up even receiving gifts, and he goes back home full and in good shape and unscathed. So what do we say about his bad decision? We say all's well that ends well, maybe. Well, maybe not. That might be what you would come away with if you did not look at the propagating effects. So let's think about the propagating effects a little bit. Now, we won't turn to these for the sake of time, but I'll just say Lot was with him when he went down to Egypt, and they were both increased with goods. So Abraham received gifts, oxen, and so on. Lot was increased as well for having gone there. And interestingly, later on, their goods got to be so much that they divided them. So interestingly, Abraham and Lot were in harmonious fellowship, and Abraham was able to be a very good spiritual influence on Lot until they got so many goods that their goods divided them. So goods, even in spite of the name, they're not always a good thing. And in that case, the goods were not. So they divided them. And Lot, it says, looked out towards Sodom and saw that it was like the well-watered plains of Egypt. In other words, he had a taste for that kind of scenery from Egypt. And perhaps his visit to Egypt is what influenced him going on going on to Sodom. He's soon in Sodom, not just near Sodom. He's in the gate. His own relatives are destroyed, and any good that he had done in Sodom came to an end. So we might think that Abraham going to Egypt had no bad effects, but that's only if you end at chapter 12. If you keep reading, you realize that there are propagating effects. And that's not all. Not only a propagating effect on Lot, but a propagating effect on the rest of the world. Because it says in Genesis 12, we read that he received, among other things, female servants. And when Abraham and Sarah had their plan to try to conceive, even using Hagar, we find out that Hagar was an Egyptian servant. And we read that in 16:1 of Genesis. So it seems that Hagar came from this visit to Egypt when he received female servants from that trip. And they had Ishmael, of course. And, much of the Muslim world today traces its lineage back to Ishmael. So you ask yourself, what are the propagating effects of Abraham's decision? Well, there were a lot. What would the world be like without Ishmael if there were no Ishmael? And the answer is, I don't know. I don't know what it would be like, as much as to say it would be very different. So we can't just close the book on Genesis 12 and say everything ended just fine. There were propagating effects. So there are propagating effects of bad decisions. But there are also good things in propagation. The beginning of Genesis 12 gives us that aspect. And that is the promise that Abraham would be the father of a line, a special line of people. Christ would come through this line, and blessings to the world would come through this line. So if we think about this as the good news and the propagating effects, let's look at Abraham and what happened to him. Now, how many sons did Abraham have that were part of the promise at the beginning of Genesis 12? And the answer to that is one. Ishmael doesn't count with regard to the promises that are described here. He had only one son, and he had him at age 100. Now, at age 60, his son Isaac has a son. He has Esau and Jacob, but Jacob is the only one for whom this promise applies. So Abraham is 160 when Jacob is born. So Abraham overlaps Jacob for 15 years. Abraham will die when Jacob is 15 years old. So, and they dwelt together. We read that in Hebrews. They knew each other. It's not like they were living apart or something like that. Now, if you went to Abraham and asked Abraham how God used Abraham, in his life, Abraham may point to this promise and say, well, God has made me a promise that I'm going to be greatly used. And then you say, well, let's see the fruit. How many of you produced, Abraham? And Abraham would have to say one, at least according to for this promise. Okay, Abraham, well, how much has he produced? One. Whoops, you can't see my one because of the Zoom. All right, there it is. He would have to say one. Now, Abraham would die before he sees anything else in terms of the propagating effects of his life, at least with regard to this promise. But is that the end? Well, the answer is no, it's not the end. Jacob is going to have 12 sons and daughters on top of that. Abraham doesn't see it in his life, but these 12 sons and their daughters would grow to be 70 people altogether when you count the extended family. They're going to go into Egypt as a family, and then they're going to leave Egypt as a nation. And then the rest is history. I mean, the rest is literally history. And of course, Christ himself would come through that line. So when you look at Abraham's life, you say, well, Abraham didn't produce much, did he? I mean, okay, one, and he produced one. Well, don't judge things too quickly. And the same is true of ministries of people. Sometimes we may serve the Lord for long periods of time and look at what we've produced and say, well, I'm not sure that that was so much. But you don't know what God will do with it. We don't know what God would do with these things. So within his life, he saw little fruit in terms of his physical line, but that is not the end. And the same is true concerning spiritual fruit in countless lives throughout the centuries of the church. I'll give a quick example of this as I'm keeping an eye on the time. August Frank, we can talk about. We all know August Frank. And I say that a little bit in jest because I don't think we all know August Frank. So let's not talk about August Frank. Let's instead talk about George Mueller. We know about George Mueller. So George Mueller, there he is with his orphanage, 2,000 people at a time in his orphanage. Over the years, blessed the lives of 10,000 people who went through the orphanage. And this is a man who didn't have a dime to his name. He simply prayed to a God who could supply needs. And God always supplied the needs that they had. And the children never went hungry or never were without shelter. Here's a man who grew up a scoundrel, a thief, but the Lord saved him, turned his life around, and he became one of the most trusted people with money. And thousands and thousands of orphans went through his orphanage in Bristol, England. I went to it, by the way. I saw the building that these orphans are outside of right now. A friend of mine was in Bristol and was being driven home from the assembly by an elderly man who said he was one of the orphans in George Mueller's orphanage. Not when George Mueller was alive, but a little bit afterwards. But I want you to just remind you of George Mueller and his orphanages, that there were propagating effects because other people around the world saw what he did and read about it and said, we have the same God, we can do the same thing. Hudson Taylor was tremendously influenced by what George Mueller did and took the ideas of faith to serve in China and then propagated to start China inland missions. The orphans themselves had ministries that spanned around the globe, some as far away as New Zealand, some in San Francisco that I've read about, and so on. And there was an Ireland revival that took place in Ulster, where within a period of a year, 100,000 people professed faith in the Lord, starting with a prayer meeting of just a handful of four, 1 to 2, and then to 4, and then those 4 prayed. But they did it after seeing God answering George Mueller's prayers, not to mention the influence on me. So we can take this a little further, right? I mean, the other orphanages had their propagating effects. Hudson Taylor had his propagating effects. The other orphans and their ministries that have gone on have their propagating effects. The Ireland revival certainly has propagating effects even through today. So you get the idea. Now, I do want to close with a thought by and say that George Mueller's building on the foundation cannot be evaluated until the end of the church, really, because the propagating effects are still going on. Now, August Frank, the guy I mentioned earlier that maybe we haven't heard of, he lived over a century before George Mueller. And interestingly, he started an orphanage. George Mueller, as a young man, went to university next to that orphanage. And in fact, for a couple of months, stayed in a room in that orphanage while he was attending school. And it was there that he was exposed to the whole idea of an orphanage. August Frank was long dead at this time. And then later in life, when he's in Bristol, England, the Lord puts his hand on George Mueller, and George Mueller says, Lord, are you wanting me to start an orphanage like August Frank did? And here is a man who lived in the 1600s to the early 1700s. We hardly know anything about him, but here he was faithful to God, and he started an orphanage, nowhere near as big as George Mueller's. But this had an effect on George Mueller. Here's a man who was faithful to the Lord, who no doubt saw some fruit in his life, but he would have never guessed how the Lord would use what he did in centuries to come to propagate effects throughout the world. So let's be encouraged. Judge nothing before the time, as 1 Corinthians 4:5 says, and particularly remember the well-known verse in 1 Corinthians 15. Be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. It's true of us as individuals, and it's true of a place like Greenwood Hills, whose propagating effects are going on in ways that we'd never be able to track them all down. And I think it'll be fun, glory, to be able to see what God has done with our own lives and what God has done with a place like Greenwood Hills. So I think we've come to the end of our time. So why don't I stop sharing, and I'll turn things over to the powers that be.